This is going to be a brief introduction on safety measures on a table saw, and we're going to cover all the parts of the table saw and how to effectively use it. So what I've got my hand on right now is the fence of the saw. That runs parallel with the blade, perfectly parallel, and you want to keep the stock that you're cutting against that so that there's no airspace between the blade and the fence. Now, I've got my hand on the blade right now. I would not recommend doing that, as blades are sharp. But as I said, you want to keep the board parallel with the blade and fence so that it will not wiggle and bind on the blade. Now, this that I've got my left hand on right now is the miter gauge, and that's going to allow you to cross-cut any stock roughly 5 inches wide, I think I can do on this saw. And it allows you to do that effectively going against the blade, which you wouldn't normally want to do, but since you've got a miter gauge, it's supporting the back of the board and keeping it at the same angle. Now what's in my right hand now is a push stick, and what you use a push stick for is pushing stock through the saw nearing the end of your cut when the board you're ripping is less than 5 inches wide on the good side of that board, the side that you've got between your fence and the blade. Now what I currently have in my saw is a 36 tooth blade, and you'd use that for roughing out any framing, so ripping any 2x6s. You'd rip sheet goods down with it. Essentially it's just an all-around blade. Now what I just showed you is a 60 tooth blade, and you'd want to use that for doing any moldings, any cross-cutting on any hardwood. Essentially finer cuts that you want less tear out on. Now the knob I've got my hand on right now, on this saw, raises and lowers the blade. If you push it in though, and then turn it, it changes the bevel on the saw itself. And this saw can go down to a 56 degree bevel. Nope, sorry, it's a 45 degree bevel. And again, that blade staying parallel with the fence, which is very important here, as you don't want any space between the front of the blade in the fence and the back of the blade in the fence. Again, your board will bind and shoot backwards, and that's called kickback. Now, one thing to note when using a table saw is you only want your blade to be about 1/8 of an inch higher than the stock itself. See, if I'm ripping a board through the saw and the blade's only set 1/8 of an inch above the workpiece itself, if my hand goes over that blade, I'm only going to cut myself about 1/8 of an inch, as you can see here. Now, if I had the blade back up at 3.5 inches, that's going to cut my hand off. It's not going to be very forgiving either. It's not going to be a quick surgery to reattach it or anything. Now, when you rip boards through a table saw, you want to keep the boards parallel to the blade and the fence. Now, this will ensure that, again, there's no wiggle in there, which will keep the board from twisting and binding and shooting back. A loose board on the table saw will kick back, and that kickback will send that board through a wall or a person if a person's just in the line of it. A table saw can be a very effective tool, and it is a very effective tool, only when used correctly. Use it correctly. Don't make the mistake. One slight mistake can change your whole life, especially on this tool.